Hello and welcome to the SDGs Cities Climate Change and Cities Symposium. I'm Sarah Forde, Director of Projects and Programs with the Business Council of Sustainable Development Australia. We work with forward-thinking companies to accelerate the SDGs. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet? I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We would like to extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today. I'd like to welcome you to this first City Partnership session. This is your opportunity to hear from cities participating in the SDGs Cities Challenge. Following an overview from our city, we will be taking questions and comments, and I'll now introduce our speakers. Thomas Jacobs is the Project Coordinator for the SDGs Cities Challenge and Project Officer for the Innovate for Cities project with the Connected Cities Lab. Our SDG City representative today is Lucy Menzies, the Sustainability Officer from the City of Whitehorse. And joining us from the US, Anna Rubbo, an alumni of Melbourne University, Senior Scholar at the Centre for Sustainable Urban Development at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Anna launched the Accelerating the SDGs, a global project showcasing 110 projects from 39 countries, gaining traction across various SDGs, and you can find them at localprojectchallenge.org, which I'll pop into the chat in a moment. I'll now turn over to Thomas Jacobs to introduce the challenge. Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and hello everyone, and welcome. I'm going to give a bit of a rundown of the SDG Cities Challenge before turning it over to our phenomenal guest. So the Connected Cities Lab, partnered with the Business Council of Sustainable Development Australia and the Banksia Foundation, have sought to identify the best for cities to deliver on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, this participatory action research project. The SDG Cities Challenge asks interested cities to align an existing or new project to a key urban SDGs. Specifically, in this project, it's within SDG 11. The idea behind this strategy is that cities can begin their journey of learning about the SDGs through focusing on SDG. In this case, as I said, SDG 11, use that knowledge to expand, align, and then embed the targets and indicators within the SDGs into their city challenges. So early on, we recognized that there's a wealth of resources available for cities and businesses to support the implementation of the SDGs. However, it is not always easy to find a methodology that best fits a city's local context and identifies appropriate local solutions. The SDGs Cities Challenge links cities with their urban partners in academia, business, community, and civil society in a structured process of co-design. This is aimed to create innovative approaches for cities to accelerate actions towards the SDGs using an iterative and co-designed project. Solutions relating to this project have been worked through via collaborative process using knowledge and practical expertise, as I said, in local government, academia, business, society, offering the city the opportunity to produce an implementation plan or potentially a voluntary local review or getting begun on the voluntary local review process. We've just held 2 full days of intensive workshops on Monday and Tuesday that were aimed to give our participating cities the opportunity to share their experiences and urban challenges and their progress in mapping their work against the SDGs with expert support from a diverse group of urban stakeholders. So I'm really excited to turn it over in just a second and hear from the cities and learn about their city challenges and about their learnings from the challenge itself and the possible linkages they've made to the SDGs. So I might turn it over now to Lucy Menzies, one of our 10 participating cities in the SDGs Cities Challenge from the city of Whitehorse. Lucy?
Thanks, Thomas. Appreciate that, and we appreciate very much the opportunity to be part of the challenge. It's a wonderful opportunity for a city such as ours, which is just beginning the journey into looking at incorporating SDGs. If we could move on to the first slide, I think it's really important to provide a little bit of context about the particular city that we're working with, because part of the challenge of localising SDGs is fitting them into the size and the realm of control that a particular city has, and also their accessibility to data and all sorts of things. So the City of Whitehorse is located in Melbourne's eastern suburbs, which is about 15 kilometres east of Melbourne. We're reasonably small compared to lots of other municipalities, 64 square kilometres, with a growing population. At the moment it's 182,000, looking at probably 25% increase on that by 2040. So I think all those things are important to consider when looking at development projects. The Wurundjeri Balak tribe are the traditional custodians of the land, and they have been the traditional custodians for 40,000 years. Thanks, Steph. So our challenge is quite specific. As a council, we haven't adopted the SDGs as an organisation-wide framework. We're going to look initially at the procurement policy, and then be able to use that as a case study to demonstrate how we can use the SDGs when setting our goals across the organisation. So the challenge is to develop a robust, sustainable procurement process that does all these things, measures the whole life cycle sustainability of goods and services, and also acknowledging our role of leadership in this space by showcasing how the community can do the same. It should incorporate an effective assessment and monitoring system that takes into account embedded energy, emissions, transport and end-of-life capabilities, and support sustainable manufacturing and decent working conditions. So those last two factors are things that we see as perhaps missing in the traditional local government approach to procurement that tends to highly weight financial cost as the measure of value, which is definitely the easiest way to do it, but we want to really take a much more holistic approach. So the project aligns with SDG 11, as all our projects do, which is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. And it's interesting to note that that probably doesn't naturally connect the mind with procurement, but when you delve further into the targets and indicators of that goal, it really sits quite well with our challenge. So ensuring we have a good understanding of the impact of our purchasing decisions on the populations and environment of other cities as well as our own, we can contribute to sustainable development beyond our municipal boundaries. So I think as a local government in the middle ring suburbs of Melbourne, it's very easy for us to kind of consider our decision making as just that which impacts the residents and the businesses within our boundaries, and we really want to take a much broader approach, acknowledging our in emissions and social sustainability beyond that. Thanks, Jeff. So progress to date. We've got a couple of things running in parallel. So being part of this challenge project, but we've also undertaken a mapping exercise, which was a project with Deakin University to look at 19 of our key council policy documents and localise the targets of each to see kind of where we're at within our policy, which it's important to note that's where we strive to be. We haven't done an assessment of on the ground where we are, and there's there's not a lot of data available about lots of the goals at a local government level, but it's provided a really good snapshot of where the gaps are and the opportunities that we could improve in our policy, and it's very aspirational kind of what we can gain from this. So the report will be an effective education tool for staff. It's primarily going to be used as an internal document, but really to highlight how everybody's actions have an effect way beyond their own budget and the municipal boundaries. Thanks, Steph. So what next? We're going to collaborate with industry and other councils for support and information sharing. So thinking specifically about procurement, there's actually a lot of service providers and manufacturers that are already thinking about SDGs and have some kind of framework that they're working within. And we need to be able to work with them to upskill them and to find common language and acceptable shared responsibility for how we can monitor the, for example, full life cycle impact of what they're providing, or the emissions along the whole supply chain of the service they're providing. We propose specific steps, or we will propose specific steps that can be taken to align that policy and process improvement with the SDGs to create a case study to then argue that the SDGs are a great framework for much broader policy development across council. And we will definitely use that mapping report and the procurement policy work that we're doing through this challenge to be able to take that to council and say this is really something we could consider that aligns really well with what I see our role is in a much broader context. Learning so far, there's been so many, but a couple of things to note is there's not one size fits all. There's not a clear process to be followed to embed SDGs into local government. One thing that I feel can be overwhelming is the need to monitor and to measure. And I've come to the realisation through this process that we shouldn't delay moving things forward just because perhaps we don't have data. They are by nature and by name goals, things to aspire to, which I think is what's important to focus on rather than things to measure. Collaborate. Councils across Australia are all at different stages and across the world. One thing that's particularly interesting to me is that we looked a little bit at community knowledge of SDGs, and in developing countries there's much higher community knowledge and understanding of not only the term of what SDGs are, but how they can be used. And that doesn't seem to have had the same uptake in developed countries. So I think education's a really big component. And I guess my last point there ties in with that. It's been interesting to discover that SDGs are something that's really incorporated into the Victorian curriculum, and young people are coming out of school with a better knowledge than what my colleagues currently have. So we need to upskill and really improve that, and certainly bring young people on for the ride. It's an aspirational thing. They are goals. It's something that should be shared, especially with youth. I think that's probably it.
Thank you, Lucy. That was excellent. Really interesting breadth of learnings there. Can I ask you, so you've been on this journey with us for the SDGs Cities Challenge since the beginning of the year, and you've obviously been thinking about procurement and a way of tackling this idea of how to localise SDGs in some form into your council. Can you just explain, do you think you're more equipped now, or do you think you're on a better pathway, or do you think the network that you've created through collaborating with other cities, what are some of the things from the challenge that have really helped you move forward that you'll take away with you?
Yeah, I think one learning, particularly from the experience Monday and Tuesday when we had some workshops with a diverse range of cities and stakeholders, was seeing that there's not one right approach. So embedding SDGs has often come from perhaps community groups or officer level and moved up the chain to get higher level support. In other municipalities, it's been a councillor-driven process that's then filtered down through the organisation. And it seems like there's not one right way. So I think we're very much coming from a bottom-up approach. So the idea was that we would map where we sit currently with our policy and use the procurement policy as a case study to then try and get broader buy-in and endorsement. But there's been examples, and it's really reassuring to know that there's not just one way. I think just starting the process is really what's important.
Fantastic. And just on that then, when you look at procurement, have you identified any specific, I know there's not one process, but specific lines of action that you think you're going to take that's been really helpful?
Yeah, something that's concerned me is the expectation from local government that industry will provide all the information that they need to be able to monitor how sustainable the goods and services they're buying or offering are. But I very strongly feel it needs to be a shared journey. I think there's a big risk if we mandate what kind of reporting those service providers or manufacturers need to give us, that we cut out small and potentially more local providers because they can't give us that information. So definitely an opportunity to collaborate and build some learning development for everybody we work with, to find that shared language and a comfortable middle place for that.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point, that shared language, because if you are a service provider and you're working with a number of councils and everyone's asking you for different things and to fill in a different form to show what your life cycle analysis is and a different way of presenting, have you got modern slavery in your supply chain? It's just too much, even for larger organizations, to take that on. So the idea that you mentioned that you've really learned around collaboration and that common language seems like something very valuable that you'll take away. And I suppose through the challenge, you've developed a network of cities already that you can continue those conversations with.
Yeah, and I think perhaps there's also an advocacy role there, that we can advocate to different levels of government and ask for support with that, because that's something obviously beyond the, realm of influence that one local government organisation has. So I think it'd be great to get some buy-in at the different levels of government and a bit more conversation about SDGs and how we can make it happen.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Lucy, so much. I'm going to now call on our colleague across the pond, Anna, to join us. So Anna Rubbo, as I mentioned, she's a senior scholar at the Centre for Sustainable Urban Development at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. That's very impressive. Anna, I'll hand it over to you.
I hope my volume is okay. It's a bit further than across the pond, and I'm not sure whether it's reaching, but I just wanted to talk about a project that I've been doing over the last few years. And just as preamble, I started off with the MDGs, and then I've moved to the SDGs. So I've been thinking about how these big frameworks, 15-year frameworks, can actually influence things. So I want to focus on the most recent project, which is called Accelerating the SDGs, which is having 3 stages. The first is a city maker survey that we completed in last year, and we had almost 1,500 responses asking how the SDGs traveling in your world. So we had a lot of information from that. So the second project was then the local project challenge, and this is what I'm focusing on today. And the local project challenge was finished at the end of last year. We're now into trying to bring all this together to disseminate and to think about next steps. What might we do next? So could I have the next slide, please? Whoever's setting the slides. Next. Okay, so what is the local project challenge? It was a call for local design and planning projects that engage with the SDGs. Its aims were to increase awareness of the SDGs, and this was mainly based on a hunch that a lot of people don't know about the SDGs, a lot of people are outside the UN world, and so therefore we could go out and see if we couldn't tempt people into taking up the SDGs. We were surprised by the number of projects that we received, 111 projects from 39 countries. We divided them up into civil society projects, professional projects, and educational projects. And here you can see on this map how they dot around the world. Next, please. Next slide. Okay, having finished this, no, back one. Back. Can we go back?
Yeah.
Thank you. Having finished this project, we took it to the World Urban Forum in February, just before COVID hit, and we had an international panel making assessments of these projects and making some awards, and we also did a people's choice vote. So I have been extremely keen in the work that I've done is how do you get a message out to a lot of people? we were surprised that we had over 7,000 votes for a People's Choice Award in this project. So at the World Urban Forum in February, we made these awards. Subsequently, we've done a feedback survey with the people who participated. And I think this is sort of interesting to see what, when you go out without any particular target group in mind, what do you find out? So what we found is that take up of the SDGs in future work is actually very promising. 100% said it's fairly likely. How many shared it with their networks? 93% said they shared it with their networks. Then I was very interested, as we're already into the pandemic, what did people consider to be the usefulness of the SDGs post-pandemic? And we found again that 98% thought they were moderately or very relevant. So I thought this was very interesting data to think if you go out to find out what is the take-up, what is the perception of them, and where it might go. Next, please. Next slide. Okay, to just give you a bit of a flavour of the project, these are some slides from the website that we made. And what we were extremely keen to do was to make a website that was very seductive. We wanted it to be beautiful. So we got all the information in on the back end of it, and then we created these pages using Adobe Spark. So I'm just going to give you some examples from professional projects, since I mentioned there's a lot of architecture. From Arab, we had, sorry, I've lost my slides. Arab, we had a project in Colombia, and the bottom slide is one from the Gibson Desert, an Aboriginal project, which embodied many of the principles that we were very keen to see in these projects, which was a lot of community involvement, a great deal of toing and froing with the architects. So that, I think, was very interesting. The next group of projects, if we could have the next slide, is a group from education. And since presumably, again, a lot of people in this audience are in education, either as students or faculty, I wanted to just point out a project from Ireland, which this has led to all schools in Ireland taking up the SDGs. New Zealand, they're working on it. And I've put in brackets, what were the SDGs that they used, how many, 3 SDGs in the New Zealand place, and 3 targets. How do we get them to identify targets? Because this was also asking people to going into territory they'd never been into. So they had the goals, and they identified the goals, and then we gave them a list of all the targets, and we asked them to identify which targets corresponded to their projects. So it was also a way of educating them to the targets, and this I thought was a really good device. So there's 2 other projects on this page, and one is the public school 54 in Brooklyn, a low-income, very disadvantaged Afro-American school, which is doing fabulous work, and it really propelled their work by joining this, and the kids were extremely pleased. And lastly, a document which I would recommend to you, which is the Danish Academy of Fine Arts guide, architecture guide to the SDGs. Next, please. I want to just switch now with this next slide to talk about COVID, because I think all of us have been terribly preoccupied with COVID. Maybe you're not, well, in Melbourne, I know you have been preoccupied with COVID because you're all locked down. But if we could have the next slide, I wanted to just alert you to, over the summer here, there's been a lot of discussions. And one of the discussions I was involved in was a high-level political forum. And I don't know whether we can ask Steph to advance the slide. Is that possible? Anyway, this slide that I am hoping to talk to is a slide which, as I went back into looking at the, I asked some of the people who had participated in the local project challenge, how were they coping with COVID? And so I looked at them and I selected out here. Are they seeing the slides? Can I just ask you, Laura, are they seeing the slides? Sarah, are the slides visible?
Yes, they are.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. So I don't, that's fine because I can't see them.
Pop you on the control room down the bottom.
Okay. Good. Anyway, they're not coming up, but that's fine. So there was 4 projects that I selected, and one from New York, one from India, one from Rio, and one from South Africa. Now, the Sustainable Fairweather Network, you will all be hearing about from the wonderful director Teresa Williamson. So I'm not going to talk about that, but I would like to just emphasize the Grow NYC project and the Deep Sloot Toilets with Dignity project. And I'd also like to just to draw your attention to the number of SDGs they said they worked with. In the case of Grow NYC Teaching Garden, 12. In the case of Toilets with Dignity, 6. So while these are urban projects, they're not necessarily sticking to SDG 11. So let's just go forward the next slide, which is South Africa, Toilets with Dignity. So this page, on the left-hand side, it shows what we have online. On the right-hand side is the COVID response. And here is a terribly underserviced population. We worked with them in a previous project I did for 3 years, and we helped start this little sanitation community organization. And their response to COVID was to replace 2,000 communal taps so that people can have access to water and wash their hands. And this is just extraordinary. People with so little income, so little resources, and this is what they did. I wanted to then give you another example, which is the New York, the next slide, is New York Grow NYC Teaching Garden. And this is an extraordinary group that has a garden on Governor's Island, and it has 20,000 visitors, reaches out to schools and does a lot of education. We talked with them and they adopted the SDGs. Now, if you walk through that garden, signs of the SDGs are up everywhere. So what they can't have any kids coming there anymore, so they went into production. So what they have done, worked with community partners to deliver free fresh food boxes for low-income New Yorkers who are undocumented, unemployed, or struggling with high need. And there's a picture of some of the produce. Now, so that was just to give you a flavor of how this project worked, how we got some high-end architecture projects into it, how we got a lot of community projects into it. And I wanted just to finish with the final slide, which is I've called the critical localizing factors, which are some of the things that perhaps I have sort of reflected on in doing this project. I'm going to just highlight a few. And the first one that I would highlight is engage with people at local level on projects and issues that matter to them. And I think that's it. Very important. And I think build a community of participants. And I think we've heard a little bit about that from the Whitehorse example. And then I think it's very important to find creative ways to share knowledge and experience. And then I would like to say, because I gather that you are all focusing on SDG 11, I don't think that's the right approach myself. I will offer this contrary opinion. I think you have to think about all the SDGs and not just SDG 11. These SDGs are so interrelated. And of course, if you're going to be thinking about, say, COVID, well, you need to think about health and well-being. If you're thinking about climate action, you need to introduce Goal 13. And I think it gives more sort of voice to the richness of the SDGs. So in what we learned, cut me off, I'm going over time, but in what we learned from this project, but also from our survey project, and again, harking back to the youth that Lucy mentioned, we got strong messages from the youth that the academia needs to lift its game. They're not, we had quite a few Australian respondents as well. It needs to lift its game. Now, I want to finish finally with just one idea for speeding up the localizing or critical localizing action for universities, since I am an academic. And this is an idea, which is not an original idea, but it's to develop a national SDG super studio to take up local issues that are participatory, grounded, multidisciplinary, and advanced preparedness for action countrywide. And of course, recommending the partners, and to involve many disciplines. And I would just say this, in Australia, I think is perhaps in the same sort of situation, that the politics of the SDGs are not terribly prominent, but this seems to be a method for liaising with people, like yourselves, Lucy, to actually get a big sort of well of preparedness. And as I said, this is not an original idea. There's currently a super studio going on in the US, open to anybody in the US, and that is around the Green New Deal. And I think that is a very good idea. So in terms of going local, going out, going wide, going deep, I think there's something, maybe there's something to be had there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was very illuminating and a very interesting and definitely ambitious project that even through the COVID era seems to be bearing fruit. So thank you very much for that. I might turn it to kind of an open discussion a bit about the critical factors. You mentioned the critical factors for cities to consider when localizing the SDGs and the connections to on-the-ground tangible city projects. I think that's at the root of what we were trying to do with the SDGs Cities Challenge. As Lucy pointed out, one of the main, I think, hindrances or things that were holding the potentially could be holding some localities around in this region back is just the knowledge of the SDGs and kind of having that in their pocket. I wonder if we can kind of discuss, Lucy, you brought up education as kind of a key point in all of this. Both Anna and Lucy, I guess how you see educating communities and getting communities on board in that way before, I guess turning towards changing the targets or altering the targets and indicators within the SDGs. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about education.
Anna, did you want to speak to that? Or? Otherwise, I'm happy to, but I'm sure you've got a lot more knowledge.
I think it's no. I think we could both have a crack at it. I think that these things are very accessible if you present them in the right way, and I think the localizing lets you explore them in different sorts of ways as well. And so it does seem to me that there should be in all curricula. There should be, the SDGs should be there, and so at least they're critically examined. And then I'm very enthusiastic as an educator to be involved in practical action as well, not just to talk about, but to actually do something. And so I think that would be the sort of way. I think it needs. You're saying it's already in the primary schools in Australia, or schools. That's really wonderful. I don't know how much it's in universities, and I certainly don't know. I think Melbourne is a bit of an exception. Thomas, I think you are a bit of an exception. You may want to correct me, but I don't know that there's that much take up of the SDGs, especially in the architecture and planning areas where I think there is so much need. Then in terms of educating at the professional level, there's professional development, certainly for in the design disciplines is absolutely required. And then there's another possibility for education, which is starting to make awards based on the SDGs. Mm. So I imagine that could be generalized out to a number of fields. I'm just happen to know mostly about sort of the design and planning fields, but I think that would be my response. Let it still get through right in. I remember Jeff Sachs, who speaks a lot about the SDGs, saying every child should know what the SDGs are. And I think that's very, very good. And in our project, we found there was absolutely no trouble in people identifying them, saying which they were doing, which targets they thought were addressing, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, if I can just speak to that a little bit, I think there's been really rich conversation recently about how to engage the community with climate education. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the learnings from that is that the more you use climate when discussing other things you're doing development-wise, if you just keep drawing the connection to climate so people have an awareness that any sustainable transport projects are actually can be a climate adaptation as well, or community development, like perhaps a community garden can help with climate resilience. And maybe the same thing can happen with the SDGs. Maybe it's not introducing the SDGs as what can be quite an overwhelming and overarching and potentially not seeming relevant at a local context. Maybe it's just drawing those lines and bringing them in when you can might be the way to do it. I query whether we can rely on the education system to prepare us for something that's a 2030 agenda. I think that takes a long time, and perhaps we need to act in both spheres at the same time to make sure everybody's on the same page.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you both. Sarah, I might turn to you. I know you've been kind of fielding the questions in the chat, and please do continue to submit the questions. I might turn to you, Sarah.
Yeah, look, I'm going to ask a question. I've put two things into the chat. Some of the questions are around, how do we communicate these SDGs? There is actually something, the Good Life Goals, which the Business Council, the World Business Council, and ourselves, the Business Council of Sustainable Development Australia, we do promote and we do training with business on, and these are available. And it's a way of turning them on their heads to, how does it matter to me as a person? And then you could have that conversation. How does it matter to me as people in our business? How does it matter to me as a child in my school? So it does it's a very good program with a number of resources to help you translate into very useful, tangible language and experience in your own level of experience. There is also, I have young children, and there is also Sustainable Development Goals, Thomas the Tank Engine, friends. And we may laugh, but little people love Thomas, and talk about cult following. They actually have developed a program of Thomas teaching young children about the SDGs, which, to your point, Anna, is an opportunity. It's talking in a language that's relevant to children can understand, again, those experiences. But Lucy, I was just wondering, during our program, and this week we had some conversations around engagement and communication and how you actually translate that into your local community. Can you reflect on anything that you might take back from those discussions to the Whitehorse community?
Yeah. Yes. I think at the moment, and being Victoria-centric, where our Local Government Act is making us reflect a lot on our community engagement, and that lots of the work we do should come directly from consultation with the community who will be guiding us. So to me, the question that's been brought up from our discussions is, how do we guide the community to suggest that this is a good way to go? Or is that taking the old school approach that we're deciding something and saying this is what we'll do, but if the community hasn't got knowledge of it, kind of what's the right order to do that and what's the right process to do that? So I haven't really got an answer, but I've got lots of questions.
Lucy, could you give an example of where that might have happened? Around what sort of issue? The community is behind and you're in front, but you want them to be in front, sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've just been thinking about it in this particular context, and it's a recent community engagement model that we're going to be utilising, and it sets quite a structured process by which we consult with the community and get their ideas about what they want to do. So I guess our climate response would be one thing like that. Our level of response needs to correlate with the level of urgency and the priority that the community sees that's an issue. So I think it's probably something specific to the local level of government, and we would benefit, well, as I said earlier, from support at higher levels of government suggesting that this is the way that local governments should approach development.
We have a question or a comment rather from Timothy, who's saying, you know, while we talk a lot about education and this is good, there's a step before around people feeling empowered and engaged to actually participate in discussions around these topics to see if they are relevant to them, that they then have the power to take that somewhere or to have those discussions. Anna, is that something that you've come across in your work?
Yeah, and I see that Timothy is referencing Freire, who is one of my favourites. Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian educator who talked about education for liberation, or banking education, as he called it. And this is, I mean, the work that I've sort of been doing lately had its sort of roots in both, initially in South America, and then in a task force on improving the lives of slum dwellers. And one of the sort of key factors was coming to the realization through this UN task force that around the world, of all the places we visited, that people would say about the urban professionals, they don't listen. They just don't listen. So I started up a program called Global Studio, which was essentially trying to counteract and make it possible for professionals to work more effectively with the urban poor. And there's a sort of great sort of cultural divides and knowledge divides and so on. But it was based very much in a Freirean model. And the model was that that you had to find out, and this is exactly what Freire did with teaching literacy, which is you find out what is relevant to people, and then that's a way to enter the conversation. And the conversation is really about, what do people want? I have never met a poor person who doesn't really know what they want. You've never met a poor person who wants their kids to go hungry, the kids to be uneducated. I mean, there's no difference. So the question is to find that, and then how do you use your professional skills to help them do what they do? And I think climate change is a clear one. Poor people live in the worst places, have the most pollution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a question of conducting the conversation in ways that works for everybody. And so that would be my answer to Timothy. I don't know whether it was a good answer to Timothy, if he would like to come back on the chat. But I do think that the SDGs at bottom are relevant to everybody. They're sort of, motherhood statements in lots of respects. And when I was taking a little pot shot recently saying, I think you have to connect them all, I think it's because it's in that interconnected reality that you can start to really make progress. I think 11.7, for instance, is one of the important goals, which is about public space, access to green space, people of all types and so on. And then you start going off really into climate, into health, into education. And I think it sort of builds up a richer picture. Now, whether it gets too complicated and too unwieldy, I don't know. But I think they're basically quite simple things. I think I did have in one of my points, which was drop UNEs. And this was partly what got me going on this project. You go to lots of meetings, they all talk the same language, and they all talk to each other, and they all reinforce each other. And you go and you think, oh my gosh, and you go and then you turn around the corner and you see somebody and you say, oh, do you know about the SDGs? No, never heard of them. But so it was that motivated me, that I thought it was a lot of internal sort of, circulating conversations that were going on. Now, this might be sort of unfair and not nice to say, but it's also, we've been sort of educating ourselves about these. So that I suppose is how do you engage people on things that matter to them and bring in the key issues, which obviously have to be, I've always seen it as a sort of form of action research, top down meeting bottom up, and how does the conversation then ensue in an equitable way.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think that in what you're describing almost describes exactly what the intention of this project is, which is taking an example and expanding it to the larger picture. I completely understand what you're saying and what you mean about not focusing on one specific goal. And I guess the idea is within learning about that one specific goal, you start to realize the interconnectedness with all of the other SDGs. And you start to understand that, oh, well, this is not an isolated thing. They're all linked, and there are benefits and trade-offs for each one. And I think that was the lens and the lane that we were trying to take this, is from that one spot, almost from a bottom up, from the SDGs perspective. So I think that that's exactly right. And to Lucy's point, I mean, trying to educate a community that may not have the background information about the SDGs, coming at it with there's 17 and there's 169 targets, that can be kind of daunting, and that it can be daunting for those that are in the field. So that is certainly an evolving conversation that we have about trying to educate the community at the same time as embed these SDGs and the targets and indicators specifically into the projects that the cities are looking at. So certainly that's our first step, and that is exactly what we're looking to do.
Yeah.
Maybe
I just add one other? Oh, sorry.
No, please, Anna.
Okay, I would just like, in response to that, I would just like to add one other thing. The UN Habitat has created a great diagram. These things are all very visual. And they've created a great diagram which links all the SDGs together, and everything links to everything else. So, but the second thing I wanted to say in response to that is, in writing up a paper on our survey, I'm searching around for who's been doing what, and I found a very interesting study, which was how people prioritize the goals. And this particular study went to academics, to corporate leaders, to various, mostly high-level people. And what they did was to say which of the goals do they think should be implemented and in what order. And it was absolutely interesting to me to see that SDG 11 was about goal 15, 16 perhaps. So I think it's worthwhile remembering that while we might be, because of our particular situations and disciplines and all the rest of it, we think mostly about SDG 11. But I can tell you, a lot of people are not thinking about SDG 11. So I think it was very salutary to see, because I know when we did our survey, everybody was sort of knew about SDG 11. Well, it was City Maker survey. But you look at this and you think, oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. Not everybody thinks that way.
That's a really interesting point. And I think everything that we're hearing today is that linking from SDG indicators to each other, you actually see the chain effect of, well, if you look focusing here, you want clean water, or you're wanting to reduce poverty. Well, actually, if you track it back of where you can actually make that difference, perhaps sometimes it starts at SDG 11. Perhaps the city needs to change, or policies need to change in the city to allow what you're saying is the thing you value the most is improving poverty. So that sort of mapping of what comes first as what's the blockage to achieve the outcome does take some of that iterative thinking of, I know you want to achieve here, but actually you just can't jump to that because all of this work has to be done beforehand. Really fascinating what we're hearing from you today, Anna and Lucy. And I think we'd all love to find that UN Habitat linking diagram. Perhaps you can share that with us so we can have a look at what that is. We've still got a few more minutes before we wrap up. Lucy, when you think about now how you're going to go back to Whitehorse, and obviously we've taken this focus on SDG 11 and then you've broadened that out and you're looking specifically at procurement, can you think how you might see opportunities within your procurement model to talk to some of these other SDGs in an earlier way? And I think you touched on like local like employment, but then I suppose in a life cycle you're looking at water, like expanding out some of those priority areas.
I think it comes back to education. I think we can do a lot of this work not even using SDG terminology, but which might be easier because it's more accessible. As we've already discussed, lots of people don't know what they are, and I feel that could be a bit of a barrier. But then we miss the opportunity to educate for the next round of improvements. So I'm not sure it exactly answers your question, but I'm cautious of taking that reductionist approach education-wise of focusing on one SDG at a time. I think it's much more important to look at it holistically and draw as many lines as you can between as many SDGs and the work you're doing that you can, because I think it highlights how important every project that council delivers is to a number of different factors. It doesn't just influence what people would automatically think it does. So a capital works program isn't just an infrastructure. It isn't just about cities, like Anna referred to. It's what allows us to have clean water and affordable clean energy. I'm cautious about focusing on one thing at a time.
Fantastic.
That answers a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to leave and close the session now, unless, Anna, you have something else you'd like to impart before you put yourself to bed for the night.
No, wonderful. Thank you very much.
It's been an absolute privilege having you both on the line, and thank you, Thomas, as well, for all your hard work in this project and bringing this together.